Hi, I'm Kitty Benton. I play the violin and viola. I am bold enough to put advanced next to me, but I'm not sure everybody would agree with that. Um, I've been a member of ACMP since 1958. I've served on the council, which was called then the board. I was secretary of the board, and then I became newsletter editor until printing costs got too great and we don't have the newsletter anymore. And the whole thing started around the holidays in 1958. I had been teaching lower school music, and I was asked to come and play in the Christmas pageant. So I went to the first rehearsal with my baby in the pram, with my 3-year-old seated on a seat that bridged the pram, and with my violin hanging off the end. And I went into the assembly hall at Brearley with this rig, sailing in like a clipper ship. And a fantastic white-haired woman bounded across the room when she saw me and said, "I love sights like that." And it was Helen Rice. And she collected musicians, I being one. She made friends with me. She invited me to a Brandenburg evening, which she had in her fabulous apartment. The apartment was built to be an artist studio. It had a double height living room with a huge window. And Helen had grown up in that apartment, and then it became hers when her parents left it to her. The living room easily held enough people to play Brandenburgs that she would have the music stands and the chairs all set up, and we would sit down and start playing. One of the things Helen loved, and she was very, very modest, and she never claimed that she was president of ACMP, although she was. She always called herself secretary. She never played concertmaster, but if she could have, she knew every single quartet by heart. But she loved to play the slow movement of the Brandenburg No. 3, which is just 2 notes, a dominant and a tonic. And she took the solo for that with a great big smile and played them. Of course, we all played our parts too. And then she kind of had an idea of how well you could play, what you could manage, and then she would plan chamber music evenings, inviting people that she thought would be compatible with you and that you'd all be at the same skill level. And she always played, so you had the joy of hearing Helen play. She loved to play second violin, and she knew exactly what you had to do to make the first violin sound good. Helen was all ACMP at the beginning. She had an incredible Rolodex, and every musician she met, she would add to the Rolodex. Wherever she was, it spread all over the place. She spent the summers in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. There's a funny little story, connection there. An English teacher that I'd had when I was in high school retired to Stockbridge, and she was a dyed-in-the-wool spinster, as was Helen, and they were great friends. Later, this is really sort of taking a circuitous route for this story. My husband was with Time Life Books, and they brought out the Foods of the World series, and he had talked the Russian consulate into giving a party to introduce the book. So we went down to Washington, and it was some party. The food was all Russian, of course, and it was delicious. I was standing there looking at the portrait of Lenin, daydreaming that it looked a little bit like Trevor Howard, when my eye traveled down and I saw my English teacher standing next to Norman Rockwell under the portrait of Lenin. And I rushed over and I said, "Miss Pundy." And she looked back at me and very firmly corrected me and said, "Mrs. Rockwell." And she had given a class in poetry in Stockbridge when she retired, and Norman Rockwell had recently been widowed, and lo and behold, love bloomed over poetry. And Miss Pundy, or Mrs. Rockwell as we call her, was a friend of Helen's, but she was not musical. I met other people who were really extraordinary people through Helen. One of them was Carleen Hutchins. Carleen Hutchins was an acoustician, and she won many prizes for her scientific knowledge. But when she ended up teaching science at the Brearley School, those were in the days when Millicent McIntosh, the legendary Millicent McIntosh, was the head mistress of the Brearley School. The whole McIntosh family played chamber music like mad, and of course they were friends of Helen's. So every Friday afternoon they would have chamber music after the students had left. Carleen had grown up playing the trumpet, and I think Helen said to her, "You know, Carleen, there isn't too much chamber music for the trumpet. Why don't you take up the viola?" So Carleen took up the viola, got fascinated with the sound, started making violas, and made very successful ones. I actually have one of her violas. It has a lovely sound. So in the early days when she was making violas, she had to have surgery, and she was up in the hospital at Columbia Presbyterian. And Helen called her and said, "Carleen, what shall I bring you in the hospital?" And Carleen said, "Sandpaper." So Helen got sandpaper, and she boxed it up as if it came from Henri Bendel, with a huge gift bow on it. And when she got to the hospital, this was the night before Carleen's surgery. In those days, you checked into the hospital the night before, and the anesthetist came and met you while you were still talking and making sense, so she'd know what you were like. So when Helen got there, there was the anesthetist, who happened to be Virginia Apgar. Virginia Apgar was so amazing as a gynecologist, an obstetrician, and anesthetist, that she would have been chair of that department had not the idea that no women could ever be elected as a chair of a department. So she was sitting there, and when Carleen opened the gift box and out came sandpaper, she thought it was great, and they started laughing. And the three of them made friends like a California wildfire, and they were friends for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, after the surgery, Carleen noticed a telephone booth shelf, and this was before cell phones, so you had to use the telephone booth. It was made of curly maple, and she wanted it for a viola bag. So she went back to Brearley, made a new shelf in the shop there, painted it, finished it, and brought it up, and Virginia in her medical coat, and Carleen, and of course Helen went along for this expedition. They pried out the curly maple shelf, and they started to put the new one in, and it was too big. So they had to take it into the ladies' room and saw it down, and with lots of giggles, they finally got it in place and took the curly maple back to Carleen's workshop. She made a violin and a viola out of it. She gave them to the student doctor orchestra, where they're played today in concerts. I was on the board. I was secretary of the board. And then I became the newsletter editor, which I did for about 20 years. I loved it. I got to talk to people all over the world, and the stories were so interesting. And there were people in China, and people all over Europe, people in South America. One of the wonderful stories I covered as a newsletter editor, and they were all over the map, by the way. There was one about teachers of autistic children in China and what it meant to those children. And this one I'd like to share involved a pilot who flew in China, and he was a cellist, and he always put his cello in the cockpit behind him. And when he arrived, he would use the directory to set up chamber music for his layovers wherever he was. And it illustrates the length that chamber music fanatics will go to. There are lots of them, and they're very much at home in ACMP.